Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Veeam Cloud Talk. This will be our second episode, and today we're going to talk about the true cost of cloud adoption and the migration as well, right? So I guess this is something that is going to be very interesting because it's the dollars and cents that is close to our heart. And today we have with us, very honored to have Franco Chiam, who is the general manager from Daimler Southeast Asia. He's a general manager for digital transformation and innovation lead. So I want to give a big welcome to Franco, and I'm very privileged to have him today. Franco, can you give us a little bit of introduction about yourself first?
Sure. So thanks for the starting point, Casa. My name is Franco, actually coming from Daimler. Been about 13 years in the company. So I have about 20 years of experience managing the IT infrastructure related components, starting from the early days of the, let's say, pure physical systems into virtualization context. Then we look at the microservices and also then portability to the cloud environment. So I would say I spent the last of my 3 to 5 years looking into such transformation strategy to see how we can bring more value added, let's say, services to the company as a whole, and of course then bring down the overall total cost of the services.
Nice. So I think we all will be able to gain some valuable insight from you today, especially with your vast experience, right? Back in the days, from virtualization all the way to the cloud transformation today. Maybe let's just dive straight in, right? I would want to ask you maybe what is the key financial consideration when choosing your cloud strategy?
I guess when we talk about costing, when any company started with the thought process, or let's say, let's move to cloud. I think the first thing is that moving to cloud would be definitely a cheaper cost comparison to on-prem, because then you have the flexibility of the hour expansion and also downscaling, depending on the type of application you're looking at. I would say the short answer is probably a yes and no. If we just purely look at the new applications where we type based to mobility applications, those are perhaps a good start point, because then you look at the low volume, the workload are pretty much low from the beginning. But if you look at those existing applications that you plan to migrate to the cloud itself, there are potentially tons of factors to consider. And there will have to be kind of the return of investment discussions, the business case, considering what is the underlying, let's say, dependencies of the application that are circled around this entire setup altogether. Of course, then I would say moving it itself is always easy coming from the provider standpoint. But of course, then the support from the relevant applications, the business side needs to be also taken into considerations. And as overall, it should bring more benefit, not just from the cost perspective, but you should be able to leverage also on the cloud ecosystem. In a nutshell, I think that would be pretty much what most company will consider.
I think it's very interesting that you mentioned a fair bit around getting new workloads into the cloud versus trying to re-platform them and understanding the dependency and the risks around doing all that. And that actually all ties back to the dollar and cents, which we are all concerned about, right? And of course, the ROI in the investment, and how do we leverage that so that we become more agile, getting the return in investment in the coming days, right? So that will bring us to the next topic, right? When we talk about the costs associated to it. What would you think are the hidden costs or the indirect costs when you're calculating, the true cost of going into cloud computing, right? You mentioned a bit earlier around re-platform, the risk associated with it, dependency on legacy system. How do they actually equate to the dollars and cents here?
Maybe I start from the cloud platform solutions point of view. So today we have the IaaS component, the PaaS component, and the SaaS component. So ideally, the most beneficial would be if a company can directly move to SaaS. That's basically where the solution is already in place. Having looked at the kind of application that most company runs today, which are pretty much old or legacy, I would say a lot of considerations are around the IaaS and the PaaS component. But I think the main consideration started is that if we look at just purely compute comparison, Most companies today will look at today to say that if I have to spend X dollars today to purchase X hardware, I will expect a 20% to 30% savings if I move into the cloud. In a true sense, if the let's say the growth rate is substantial enough to forecast, I will always challenge it to the cloud provider to say, before I start any move, by a definition calculation, I will already expect that savings to be in place. The actual benefits will really come in once I utilize your platform as a service, because then I reduce the dependencies on the infrastructure, which means I don't have to manage the OS point of view. I don't have to worry about patching or security. I basically focus then on my application layer. Secondly, I would think also then the cost of the operation is normally missed out in the cloud migration. Some companies normally they look at it as that, oh, if I move right now my physical infrastructure to the cloud, this is the estimated cost that I will save. They sometimes let's say miss to discuss also then the operational aspect behind it, where there are people, there are engineers actually supporting the current infrastructure. Are they then equipped with the right skill sets? Do they have the right knowledge in place? And even though let's say they have the skill sets, this transition itself will take some place and time. So these are some of the hidden, let's say, more intangible cost that has to be actually measured into considerations.
Right. I think we definitely agree, right? Whenever we jump onto a new platform, be it cloud or back in the days, right, when we start the virtualization journey, the topic of the skill set and the readiness of your people and the process to go into it also has ties the equation back to the dollars and cents. And often or not, a lot of us tend to miss that out. And you're right, you actually challenge the cloud, the provider, on the savings that they promise, and of course, looking beyond and through that, so that whenever the project is being put up, we are ready for what we are ready for the true sense of it, right? So after talking about the benefits, and I think you believe that in the long run we will definitely be able to reap savings from a cloud environment or strategy. But after adopting cloud, right? What about post-migration? The kind of cost that's being associated to it, because we all know that one of the biggest advantage of cloud is the ability to be agile, and you give a lot of control maybe to your business unit to spin up services, machines on the fly. And if things are not being kept in check, right, you could come back with a bill that you might not expect in the first place. So there should be some importance around benchmarking the target environment that you're going after, and how do you all manage that?
Sure. I think that's a valid point. First of all, I think before you even start migration, the actual cost of all the relevant components from services, hardware to the resources point of view has to be, of course, then taken into consideration. I would say most companies will probably do a lift and shift approach because that would be the most easiest without much complication in place. The post-migration thought process would really comes in, I would say, as early as the first 3 months, because then you will really see what are the costs of the cloud services that are associated. For example, I know for some cloud providers, they do charge for outbound traffic. And today with some companies in luxury, this cost of the network traffic are pretty much within the company. So you do not really see that as a cost to the business itself. That's one. Secondly, if you look at just the lift and shift itself, you don't really reap the benefit of the cloud, right? And what is important is that the application has to make sure that applications are able to leverage that. Things needs to be consolidated in a better way. For example, automations of services, leverage on some of the serverless compute approach, right? And you do not need to have, let's say, specific dedicated resources that is just lying around just to execute specific tasks. So if tasks can be co-share, break it down, use serverless compute as much as possible. And even for some of the legacy services, which are more monolithic in nature, break it down into microservices. So they're less dependent on each let's say, modules. And let's say moving it to platform as a service itself would be a much better option in the long term.
Right, for sure. Right. The true benefit will come if you adopt the cloud as the platform it should be. Right. Lift and shift will be a easy method at the beginning, I would say, but it really defeats the purpose ultimately, right? I would say.
Yeah.
But there are also a lot of different school of thoughts around adopting one entire public cloud or multiple cloud or even a hybrid cloud strategy. And I would tend to think that the focus these days in the industry is more around hybrid cloud, as we recognize that there are workloads that needed to reside on-premise for some reasons, and that will be a part that wouldn't go away for a long time, right? So when we talk about hybrid cloud, again, right, there will be this challenge to balance between agility of our workload versus the cost that we're going to spend, right? So what's your take around that? How would you balance in your environment or in your organization?
So fully aligned and agree with the approach. I would say hybrid would be definitely a start point. I think first of all, we start with the point of data, because the data means different for different companies. Some data are more, let's say, security for confidential in nature. And I would think that most companies who started to adopt the cloud infrastructure would probably leave that as a last point of, let's say, migration. It normally start with then the test dev developments, or let's say those low-hanging applications where there's much less dependency on one another. I see some of the experience that we have done before where we tested with a larger set of applications. In terms of the workload itself, because of the nature of how cloud is being processed pay per use, sometimes this overruns in terms of the usage point of view, and it may not make sense to say that why are we using, let's say, heavy workload if most of the workload is running at 100%, 24/7? Does it really make sense then to utilize the cloud point of view? Coming back then to the earlier point I mentioned, it would actually be a yes and no answer depending on how we leverage then the automation or the serverless, let's say one of the service modules around it. If we just do a lift and shift, I would say, safely say at this stage, it may not bring much benefit to a company. If we just look at the purely, let's say, bring it back 5-10 years from a physical to virtual P2V point of view, that doesn't work in the cloud environment. Yeah, definitely have to consider much more factors around the optimization approach, leveraging, I would say, the cloud ecosystem around it.
Yeah, I would think so, right? I just wanted to dip a little bit deeper into this topic, because if we agree that hybrid cloud would be the approach going into that, right? And as the business demand changes along the way, the agility demand on the IT infrastructure will also change, right? Give you an example, this particular workload could be a very suitable candidate for the cloud today. 3 years down the road, it becomes something that is critical or sensitive in nature that it has to come back, to on-prem. How do you all manage the agility around that, right? How do we as industry, right, respond to the demand from the businesses? I'm giving an example where maybe it's a couple of years, but it can be as soon as next month, right? The business demands that this thing comes back on prem, and along with the data and stuff like that. So what would be a right thought process for organization to think about that, right? To maintain that agility without burning a hole, in the pocket.
Okay, maybe let me try to digest the question. I think your question is, if we move right now to the cloud environment, in the near future, should there be a consideration to move back to on-prem? How do we manage that kind of situation and thought process?
Yes.
Okay, so maybe the first question would be, for any project that we move, actually, we would always consider the pros and cons, right? And which are the risk factors and mitigation around it. So if, for example, one of the application has been moved to cloud, and in this scenario, the cost itself has further increased by 20 to 30% instead of savings, I will probably first challenge them to look into the details to say that, did we do something wrong in the first place? Are we looking at the right targets rather than moving it backwards? Because then what a lot of people miss are the one-time efforts that actually being spent, the thought process put into the architecture design from both application, from business and the infrastructure teams. All these are the sunken costs that probably people are not really putting in the calculation. rather than working backwards, it would always be helpful to relook into what has been migrated. Is it part of the process that could be simplified? What I've seen before in my experience is that sometimes the process itself is much more complicated than the technology behind it. Perhaps by cutting 50% of the steps itself, we do not need some of the functions, and that would probably indirectly bring some cost savings already to the application. Secondly, also then the people that evolve around the support team, as I mentioned in one of the earlier points, do they have the right skills or knowledge then to support the environment? Were they missing, let's say, infrastructure knowledge that needs to be educated to the team? Are they rightly using the let's say the resources or system in place? So that's the name of feel. So in this aspect, what I've seen itself with all those migration to the cloud, I've seen far lesser incident in place compared to on-prem, and that for me is a huge benefit in general. So again, coming back to your question, I would not suggest that if in fact C-level would suggest to move back to the on-prem, definitely that would be a consideration. But I think from the infrastructure team, we definitely have to put for what is actually the right measures, or let's say what is being calculated, then before we take that decision together.
Right. So I mean, I hear you, and if I didn't read you wrongly, what you really meant was the planning has to be in place and the thought process before you rush into adopting the cloud for any platform. And if we deem that it is a suitable candidate, it should be there for the long haul, right? If I interpret that correctly. Yeah. So yeah, for sure, right? So but of course, in the industry itself, I think that there are ways to circumvent around business demands on agility based on technologies, and of course, we would never want to discredit, the planning process and the thought process that was being put in way way ahead of all these things that will come later, right? And or maybe we will regret the decision, etc. So I think we are good here, and thank you very much for your time today, Franco, and we appreciate that. Thank you to all our viewers who tune in. So stay on for the next week episode, and hope to see you all again. Thank you, Franco.
Thanks, Casa, for your time as well. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a nice day, everyone.